The pandemic and its economic fallout have led to a housing crisis in Massachusetts for thousands of renters and also for many homeowners. They got some relief from a state moratorium on evictions and foreclosures that expired October 17th. There have since been local and state efforts to provide other forms of relief, including rental assistance. But is there enough to meet the amount of need and do it quickly? One attempt to come up with the answers is a brief put together by the Center for Housing Data at the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. To tell us about it is the partnership's Director of Research and Analytics, Tom Hopper. Thank you very much for being with us, Tom.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Tom, could we rewind a little bit before the beginning of the pandemic? It's common to look back and think that things were better before the pandemic came along, but it looks as if before this, there were some problems for renters.
Absolutely. I think the greater Boston region in particular has been plagued by a housing shortage for years now that creates an affordability struggle through rising prices. And so, we're creating a problem for especially low and moderate income renters looking to find an affordable home. And that's particularly acute in some of our urban markets inside City of Boston and the inner core, but also our gateway cities. And so thinking about housing stability and some of the issues facing low-income households, we had eviction problems prior to this crisis. We had a housing stability crisis prior to this crisis as well.
What I've noticed in Boston, and others have noticed this too, the pattern seemed to have been that there were these neighborhoods where there were these multifamily buildings or developments. They weren't very trendy until recently, and all of a sudden, maybe it's because of some transit-oriented factor, rents are suddenly starting to go up quite a bit. And I guess that translates maybe into a racial disparity as well.
Absolutely. As demand increases for high mobility areas, for places that provide opportunities and services and entertainment, it puts an upward pressure on prices, and that can influence the decisions and the repercussions for low-income households, and particularly households of color.
Well, let's come up to the pandemic period here, because until about a month and a half ago, a lot of these evictions had to be put on hold because of the moratorium. Some foreclosures, I think, were put on hold as well. What has happened since then?
So we have started to see an increase in eviction filings. For months under the state moratorium, new filings for non-payment of rent were not allowed. And now, about a month and a half post-eviction moratorium, we have started to see landlords filing for eviction for non-payment of rent in the courts.
Now, when you say evictions is a measure, and I saw the figures that you put out. At first, it looks as if they're only a little bit higher than what was going on before the pandemic. If I stop right there, it doesn't sound too scary, but you say this is going to get worse.
It could certainly get worse. And, in the weeks after the end of the moratorium, we went from somewhere around 100 new eviction filings to over 700 for the week that we posted our research brief. Since then, we've had a short Thanksgiving week where filings came down a little bit. If I'm reading some early indicators from some unofficial data, I think we're back towards that 700 number this week. And so we don't know what's about to happen. It could level off. We could still see this level of evictions. One thing that is worth mentioning, though, is that pre-pandemic evictions may have been high already. And now we're layering on a pandemic. And so evictions are always troubling from a household perspective, from a community perspective, but now they're troubling as well from a public health perspective. And people leaving their homes produces a public health problem for all of us.
I have heard this before, but elaborate a little bit, because, obviously there's got to be a moving truck involved. Where do people go next? What does that mean in terms of the dangers of transmission?
Certainly some renters facing eviction may leave on their own, may find a lower cost apartment and need to move. And there are problems with that during a pandemic and risks involved in that as well. Others we know will move in with family members, will move in with friends, and more people in a single home is problematic for transmission. Research has shown that overcrowding in homes can be correlated with higher transmission rates, and that's a problem. Still others with nowhere else to go may face homelessness. And the shelter system and the emergency assistance system have dedicated people, people dedicated to the health and safety of those who need their services, but that could put enormous pressure on that system as well.
Well, I know eviction filings are not the only way to take a measure here, because there have also been surveys, I think, as part of the census, that some people are reporting that they're behind on their rent. How bad is that, and how much of a disparity is there?
It seems really large from survey results from the Census Pulse survey. We get a wide range of estimates, but we think it's over 100,000 people in Massachusetts have responded consistently over the weeks that the survey has been implemented that they owe rent, that they're behind on rent payments. Tens of thousands of others are fear eviction of some kind in the next couple of months. And so the scale of housing instability is larger than eviction filings alone can tell us.
Now, you say it's larger because I'm reading here that there can be other things that could pressure people to move.
Absolutely. The first step in the eviction process is that a landlord issues a notice to quit or a notice of non-continuation of lease to a tenant. And we know that many tenants, when they receive that notice, either don't know their rights and don't know that only a judge can evict them, or don't want to undergo the trauma of defending their tenancy in court, and don't want to face the potential adverse consequences of an adverse judgment against them that could limit their ability to find housing in the future. And so some people, and many people we believe, leave before that eviction filing ever occurs after receiving that notice. And that's something that we're unable to track because we do not have a statewide mechanism to track notices to quit.
There are some remedies that have been marshaled. The governor's increasing aid through a rental assistance program. Mayor Walsh is mobilizing big landlords in a pledge to maybe show some forbearance. There's more help for tenants with legal representation. But when you add all that up, is there enough to do things soon enough?
I think that's the big question, and I think we don't quite know yet. I think that there are some fantastic new measures that are in place, especially through the court system and through rental assistance through the state. The courts are now focused on mediation, and so once an eviction is filed, trying to get as many cases mediated and preserving tenancy for as many renters as possible. And the state's emergency rental assistance program, primarily rental assistance for families in transition, or the RAFT program, new funding for that program should be instrumental in keeping many more families housed for at least a few more months. And that's big, and that's a lot of security during a pandemic.
Well, I imagine one other factor here is that if everybody in danger were actually evicted, and I know that's a stretch, wouldn't the property owners have a hard time finding other people who could pay the rent?
They certainly could, and in some markets we are seeing a softening in demand, and particularly in the inner core neighborhoods in Boston that have a lot of students normally, and a lot of international students normally, are seeing higher vacancy rates. But that's not true universally. In a lot of our gateway cities, we are seeing low vacancy rates and upward pressure on rents. And so it does depend on where you are within the state, where the demand pressures are, and whether or not landlords may be able to find new tenants.
What about the federal government? Is there a part of the equation here that needs to be taken up by the feds?
Absolutely. Early in the pandemic, we saw how influential and impactful the income supports, particularly through the CARES Act, were. And I'm thinking specifically of the federal pandemic unemployment compensation program, which provided $600 per week in additional unemployment assistance to households. And those income supports not only allowed families to make good decisions about what they needed, whether it was for rent or housing or utilities, food, but was also a consumer spending boost, and that's helpful as well. And so I think all eyes are on what happens on the federal government side. They have a lot of capacity to help a lot of people, and I think we're all kind of hoping for an additional stimulus package.
One thing that's hard to deny is that the pandemic has been a scare for a lot of renters and property owners. Assuming that we get over the pandemic itself within a matter of months, do you see the lasting damage, just sort of attitudinal damage?
One of the things that I think we're definitely focused on is the lasting patterns of inequality that we might see. We know that the pandemic, both in terms of health consequences and economic consequences and job losses, have hit low-income communities, Black and Latinx communities more than other people. And the longer the crisis goes on, the deeper it goes, the harder it is to recover from those inequitable consequences.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to explain.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Tom Hopper from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. We'll have more news in just a moment.